and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding, and today we continue our read through The Lord of the Rings, looking at it from an author's point of view. And we have reached chapter 8 in The Two Towers, and that's called The Road to Isengard. Now, this is one of those interesting chapters which is transitional, and so not much attention is given to it in filmic versions of it, except for the very beginning and the very end. But there's a lot to unpack in this, and including a most beautiful passage of description by Gimli and the glittering caves of Aglarond. So there's a lot to look forward to in this episode. So just to get your head around what it contains, it first of all starts with the immediate aftermath of the Battle for Helm's Deep. Then there is the journey of Theoden, Gandalf and his entourage as they go to Isengard, and they're not sure what they're going to meet there. And then there's a short comedic section at the end when they reunite with Merry and Pippin, which is fabulous. Anyway, let's get down to business. So the first thing to note is how this starts. There's a formality in the language here. We've been with these characters for a long time, but there is a return to their full sort of titles. So we get Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and Legolas the elf, Erkenbrand of Westfold, and so on. It is the roll call, the Battle of Honor roll call that comes at the end of the successful defense of Helm's Deep. And we only really zero in on a character when it comes to Gimli, because we get Gimli emerging from the caves, and what we're looking at is his wound. He had no helm, and about his head was a linen band stained with blood, but his voice was loud and strong. He's the first one who actually emerges from this group with a sort of something distinct about them. And this is to set up the fact that the game that they've been playing, this is the end of it. So he announces that he has managed to kill 42, and the last one, his axe is notched. And then you get Legolas with his response, "You have passed my score by 1. This scene is nicely done in the BBC audio version of it. I didn't like the Peter Jackson version of this very much, with Legolas shooting a dead body. That didn't seem very funny to me. But what I like about the Tolkien version of it is you get here, it could be, and I've always thought this, that Legolas is saying, yeah, of course you beat me. It's what a friend might say when they know that someone really wants to win a game. Who knows? I mean, an archer is unlikely to know exactly how many they managed to kill. But anyway, I sometimes wonder if Legolas is handing the game over to Gimli here, because he's so relieved to see his friend alive. That would be a nice touch. Anyway, the game is rapidly put aside. And what they're now looking at is this mysterious forest that has emerged and dealt with the orcs who had invaded the Vale. And here we get the sign of the nature of Gandalf, because everybody, well, Theoden in particular, is saying, it must be great sorcery that has brought it here. And Gandalf is saying, no, I have but given good counsel in peril and made use of the speed of Shadowfax. Your own valour has done more, and the stout legs of the Westfold men marching through the night. Here, for those who want to sort of dig further into the background, if you want to see the other side of what was going on, there's a passage in the Unfinished Tales where you see Gandalf riding around the Westfold and elsewhere, gathering people together, sending them to be at the right place at the right time. There was a burial detail as well, which we meet later. So if you want to put in the background detail, do dig into that. It's in the Unfinished Tales. So the other part that we see about Gandalf here is his keynote, really. In response to their amazement, Gandalf laughed long and merrily. This is one of the areas where the good and the evil are set apart. The evil can laugh, but they laugh with scorn. Merry laughter belongs to the good. And this is often Gandalf's response. It happens again when on the fields of Cormalin. It's pure, it's what we're fighting for, this merry laughter. And what I like here is that this isn't a superhuman, all-knowing, godlike figure. He says and enjoys that there are things beyond his ken. He says that what has happened with the horns and the Ents coming is better than my design and better even than my hope the event has proved. It's that thing that Tolkien cherishes of the eucatastrophe, the unexpected good that came out of something that felt desperately bad. You can find that on page 149 if you've got a 3-volume version of The Lord of the Rings. And he breaks here into a little riddle. It has a sing-song cadence. Iron was found, or tree was hewn, when young was mountain under moon, and so on. It's not explained if it already existed or if he made it up, but it has the feeling of being old lore. And he is basically, in this whole chapter, Gandalf is a tease. He knows more than everybody else about what's happened, and he is underlining that here because he is talking about the Ents. That's the answer to the riddle, but they don't yet know that. And Gandalf here is like the author in that he is keeping the riders in suspense, not giving them the answer. In fact, he has authored this whole episode by being the person who connected all the parts together. And you'll see there's some other points where he doesn't actually say. He could give an answer and he chooses not to. So the next debate is about should they go with Gandalf or should they stay behind? Because Gandalf says, I'm going to Isengard, and they think that means another battle, but this time with a wizard. And you see how far they've all come because Theoden says, I'm not going to doubt you any longer. Just before the dawn, I may have had my moment of doubt. And Gandalf is then able to reassure. He says, we go to a parley and not to a fight. In other words, we're going to talk, not to fight. And we get a brief glimpse here of the muster of Rohan getting underway. And it's worth just making the connection here to the fact that Tolkien is writing this at a time when people were being called up across the world, but particularly across the UK. So there's a sense of a familiar background to him, this idea of word being sent out and people of fighting age being called up. Now, as I was checking the details of this chapter in the rather wonderful Reader's Companion by Hammond and Scull, there are some things which in my edition might be corrected in yours because Tolkien was an absolute, and his son, Christopher, loved precision. And so there's some details here that were corrected in editions after 2005, and my version is earlier. And the one particular one is the moon. The phases of the moon have been corrected. What does this say to us about being an author? Well, I think what it says is the world building that Tolkien has achieved is so dense, so complete, that things like that can be corrected from being wrong, which is extraordinary. And perhaps it means lesson learning here that if you do have a long period in a novel, why not follow this? Actually work out timings and moon phases and seasons properly so that you can correct it when it's wrong. And then, Christopher Tolkien's able to come in and say, well, I think this should be this. The same thing happens about distances. There is a precision here which is admirable and we should emulate. The other correction made here, according to my notes, is that one of the sad duties in the aftermath of battle, of course, is the burials. And there was a sentence about what happened to the men of Dunland. The men of Dunland were fighting on the side of the orcs. And Christopher put back in a sentence which was left out of the typescript by mistake, which is that the men of Dunland are also given a separate burial. They aren't put with the orcs, but nor are they put with the riders of Rohan. Why do we care about these things? I guess in that case, it's because it shows the value here that is a distinction made between orcs and men. It's one of the unsettling parts of Middle-earth that some lives are worth more than others. I guess the orcs are lesser creations. I don't know. It's an area which you accept as you read it, but it certainly is difficult, isn't it? But anyway, so we have a burial mound for men, 3 burial mounds for men, and a different one for the orcs. Less difficult and certainly more admirable is the role here Erkenbrand takes. Erkenbrand is, we remember, has much more of a role in the book than in any other versions I've seen of this. And he is showing mercy to the men of Dunland, which is the key quality. Gandalf is all about mercy and compassion. And that is also shown in all the good leaders. They all have mercy. Faramir has mercy. In this case, the riders of Rohan have mercy. Aragorn has mercy. And you get here him showing it to his enemies, the men of Dunland, and it transforms that relationship. We also get here a mention of the one named character who dies in this battle, and that is Harma. Do you remember that Harma was the person at the gate back in the chapters about Edoras who takes the risk to basically he's the hand behind events allowing certain things to happen. He's the one who proposes Erwin as the leader and so on. So he's clearly a key person at the court, and he has fallen in this. If you're trying to track that character to the Peter Jackson films, his Harma falls in that added scene with the Warg attack. Yeah, I mean, those, you can see why they add those scenes into a film to sort of up the tempo. But anyway, he falls in battle here, defending the gate. And there's this wonderful dissonant moment, which I hadn't noticed till reading it this time. And so I'll bring your attention to it, which is just before they set out, there's a song. We don't see the text, but we hear it being sung. So here we go. It goes, "The sun was already drawing near the hills upon the west of the Coombe when at last Theoden and Gandalf and their companions rode down from the dyke. Behind them were gathered a great host, both of the riders and of the people of Westfold, old and young, women and children, who had come out from the caves. A song of victory they sang with clear voices. And then they fell silent, wondering what would chance, for their eyes were on the trees, and they feared them." So it's like their voices, which have been raised, sort of fade away against the terrifying prospect of the woods. The woods are like the primeval place that always challenged people in sort of the northern hemisphere. Sort of often appears in fairy tales as the forbidden place, and there it's arrived on their doorstep. And I love how their voices kind of fade away. So the riders have to follow Gandalf through this wood. And how do you create the menace? Well, here Tolkien does it by contrast. So we've got things like the boughs being described like searching fingers, the roots like the limbs of strange monsters. But we also have the contrast. So we've got the road, which is like dare I say it, like a yellow brick road or something. It's the sort of safe passage, marked path. It has the Deeping Stream on one side and the sky open above and full of golden light, compared to the darkness either side and the strange cries of suffering in the hidden depths. And Legolas is the one who sums it up. He says he feels a great wrath coming from that wood. And Tolkien allows the mystery of what becomes of the orcs to remain. Gandalf says, no one will ever know their fate. And it's true that what is unseen is more scary than what is seen. So, for an author, remember allowing that mystery and holding back and not feeling you need to explain the fate of everything can sometimes be m- more horrifying. It's like what people know from horror films. When you see the monster, the mystery goes, but if you just think what that it is present, it's much more frightening. So the next part of this chapter is taken up really with the elf and dwarf cultures. And this is one of the passages that is a completely standout, beautiful moment, which I would urge you to go back and read. It is probably, I think, until we get to the end, it's the most exciting part of this chapter because it is Gimli talking with this great loquacious outburst of the caves that he had to take refuge in during the battle. He tells Legolas, and he keeps saying Legolas every few lines. There's Legolas, Legolas. It's like he's trying to, really get his attention. He says that the Mirkwood caves were but hovels. Legolas, son of a king, his palace here is being described as a hovel. Um, not very tactful of Gimli, but the contrast is there. He's not saying they are hovels, but they are as if they were. Because he has seen immeasurable halls filled with an everlasting music of water that tinkles into pools as fair as Keled Zaram in the starlight. It's on page 152 and 153 of my edition. It's too long to quote, but it does go on with this beautiful um, evocation of the experience of being in these caves. And in response, Legolas gives a bit of a feeble quip. He says, "Oh, a family of dwarves would come and, um, you know, mine all these." He misses the mood. And so Gimli has to say, "No, you don't understand. No dwarf could be unmoved by such loveliness. None of Durin's race would mine those caves for stones or ore. Not if diamonds and golds could be got there. Do you cut down groves of blossoming trees in the springtime for firewood?" And that really gets through to Legolas. And this is the seed of their bargain, where one of them Gimli will take Legolas there on their return, and he will go with Legolas to Fangorn. So how has Tolkien thought about these caves, or where's he come across them? And he mentions in later life that these caves were inspired by Cheddar Gorge, which are in the Mendips. So if you're thinking of the map of the UK or England, they're down in the western part on the way down towards Cornwall, but not as far, fairly near Bristol. And he visited those at least twice. He visited once on honeymoon, so no doubt that was a very romantic experience. And he visited it again in 1940 during the course of the war, so very recently to the time of writing. And it reminds you that there are places that stay with an author. So perhaps in your own writing, if you're listening to this as a writer, if you have a place that you keep circling back to that has an emotional charge for you, this is a good place to put in your fantasy, but in a fantasy build up to the extent of your fantasy world. Clearly, Cheddar Gorge, know how wonderful it is not as great as this place in Middle-earth. Tolkien has allowed himself to sort of big it up, to imagine an even more marvellous place. And I was wondering about this. Are there any other similar passages? Because we do stop in terms of they are riding on a horse, so now they are still moving on. It's passing the time of the journey. But there are similar passages on a few occasions in this work. And the two that came to mind were when Gimli has he's already done this, it's in the passage in Moria, when they are talking about how Moria used to be. Gimli explains how beautiful it used to be. And there's another long passage which then also has a song which he sings in the hall where they are overnighting. And that has a similar sense of poetry, but it's nostalgic. And then another passage which we have much more recently seen is the account that Treebeard gave of how the woods used to be in his youth. To jog your memory, he talks about just standing and breathing for a week. He's describing there to Merry and Pippin. And again, it's nostalgia to a lost world. What I find intriguing and different about this passage, because mostly we're talking about a world that is vanishing, is going. That's often the sort of melancholy of Middle-earth. Here it's actually future looking. Gimli is projecting a future for these caves, a return visit, what the dwarves could do. He says, we should make lights. We should make lights, such lamps as once shone in Khazad-dûm, and when we wished we would drive away the night that has lain there since the hills were made, and when we desired rest, we would let the night return. I love that, the idea that they would relinquish it and let the night come back to its natural state. So I think what is happening here is different from those other passages because Gimli is hinting beyond the end of this story. It's not all about loss. There is some gains to be made to balance out the melancholy of the loss of the elves and the loss of the beauty of the past ages. So this little section closes with a teasing comment from Gandalf. Gandalf is he's a complete tease in this chapter, let's just face it. Because I don't know if he's been listening in, but he comes back and says, when they're talking about how far to go and what will they see, Gandalf says he doesn't know. Yet I think that you will not say that the journey was in vain, not though the glittering caves of Aglarond are left behind. So he knew they existed. He's got the name for them. And just to unpack some of that beautiful naming that Tolkien does, that word Aglarond means basically glittering cave. Aglar, brilliance, and Rond is vault or high-roofed cavern. It's always lovely to unpack these words to see what Tolkien is getting at. So during their journey, they are just about at this point leaving this temporary wood, as we would call it, of the Horns, and Legolas sees eyes in the trees. So he sees the answer to the riddle without making that connection. He sees some Ent eyes. And there's this comedic bit where he wants to go and see them, and Gimli's saying, no, put me down. And Gandalf has to restrain Legolas to say, remember the mission. Now is not your time. And we get a glimpse here of the Ents coming out of the wood. And they're described again as if we're seeing them for the first time. This is because we are in the point of view of the companions, Gimli and Legolas. Not so much Aragorn, because he hasn't been present very much in this part. But very often the perspective is actually the riders. It's a sort of joint perspective. And so in order to give that freshness, we're seeing them described again as if for the first time. There's this connection in Tolkien's mind between the heron and Ents. You may wonder why. Well, herons are very common birds to be seen in the UK. We don't have so many things like storks, but it's the herons are our wading bird who have the kind of stride pattern that he imagines for the Ents. And we get here the idea that there are different worlds even within the world of Middle-earth. Gandalf says they are not concerned with us at all. And that note is often struck by Tolkien. It's the Tom Bombadil issue. His battles aren't ours. And we get it later in that encounter with the wild men of the wood, Gan Buri Gan. People creatures move in different circles, and it expands in the world building, that there are things that we don't touch because we're just in one part of it, but there is so much more going on elsewhere. So the king, who has marveled at seeing the Ents go by, he says something which is so Tolkien. It comes in the middle of page 155, where he is grappling with the smallness of their lives. We cared little for what lay beyond the borders of our land. Fangorn is literally just over the border. Songs we have that tell of these things, but we are forgetting them, teaching them only to children as a careless custom. And now the songs have come down among us out of strange places and walk visible under the sun. And he goes on to say, yet also I should be sad, for however the fortune of war shall go, may it not so end that much that was fair and wonderful shall pass for ever out of Middle-earth. So if you remember, I was saying that the Gimli passage about the caves of Aglarond is one of the sort of hopeful aftermath of battle. Theoden here is talking much more on the note that struck more often, the one of things are passing, things are going to be lost. It's what Galadriel said, that if the ring is destroyed, the power of the elven rings will probably also go. And the world is moving on. And Gandalf's response to that is to say, but to such days we are doomed. I think there are a number of things to sort of connect to here. One is it is a gloomier echo of his famous words to Frodo about all we have to decide is what to do with the time that's given to us. You know, we're in dark times. That's what we have to deal with. But it's also, I think, a sense of how Tolkien felt about the development of the 20th century. Much of what he had loved and remembered from his youth was passing. He'd lived through 2 world wars. There seemed to be a coarsening and worsening of life for him. So it is a contemporary reflection he is making there. And that's a reminder that fantasy often is about the present moment of the writer, as well as about some imagined fantasy world. And it does give an emotional weight to what the characters are experiencing. It feels real, it feels relatable. And so if you've got something equivalent, so modern fantasy, for example, often does something similar with the feeling of environmental stress and degradation. So that's the kind of meat and drink of a fantasy writer, is to look for that, what you feel strongly about, how you connect to our world, and bring that into your own fantasy creation. So they're now riding on the way to Isengard, and here we get another lovely little passage untouched by film or audio version. We see the moon is they're riding by night, so they aren't observed. So in the moonlight, in its cold silver light, the swelling grasslands rose and fell like a wide grey sea. Tolkien often reaches for the sea as an image for things on land. It will come up again when he's describing Isengard. And it also connects, of course, to the importance of the sea, voyages across the sea, Numenor, the Undying Lands. So it's all part of his imagery that he keeps, like poetry, weaving into his prose. And as they ride, they discover that the River Isen is missing, and Éomer blames Saruman for the lack of river. And here comes Gandalf the tease again. So it would seem, says Gandalf. But he doesn't say, oh yeah, it's the Ents have done this. They've flooded Isengard. None of that. He just is letting them discover the unfolding of it. He doesn't relieve the tension. He's waiting to show them what has happened. Then we get a section about the burial at the fords. Why waste time on this? It's not that particular battle doesn't happen in this story. There is a connection, of course, to the death of Theodred and the scattering of the Riders of Rohan, which you can read about in the unfinished tales in more detail. So why bother with this section? One could imagine a modern day editor would be saying, not necessary, striking it through. Well, I think what it, for me, stands for is the fact that Tolkien is always aware of the bigger picture, the bigger battles happening in and around his narrative. Things are happening up north, things are happening down south. You don't see everything. And I think this reflects his experience of real war. When he was on the Western Front in the First World War, he would have come across places where others had already fought, where ground had been lost and won on a frontier. He would have seen fortifications occupied by the enemy and lost by the enemy. And this sense that there is a moving frontier of the battle gives it what you would call verisimilitude. There's also here a respect for the dead. So perhaps it worried him that there was a feeling of unburied bodies, and in a way he's wanting to show that people deserve not to be left in no man's land but given a respectful war grave, and that's what's happened here. When they're resting on the banks of the river, which is empty, there is an interesting choreography happening. So you get this creepy passing of the horns, which aren't named, they're described like a black shadow. And then we get this little throwback to how the people of Helm's Deep see the leaving of the wood and what's been left behind, the burial of the orcs in something called the Death Down, where no one goes. And then we come back. So the orcs have gone towards Isengard. And then in the night, the river comes back the other way. So there's sort of like the passings go first towards Isengard and then away from it. And the king, Gandalf, they are the still point around which these passings are happening. There's a little point, but it's sort of part of the lovely weaving of Tolkien's prose that he thinks of these things. They arrive on the approach to Isengard into the Wizard's Vale, and this is like a foretaste of the much more ravaged landscape that Frodo and Sam are going to see. It's a sad country and treeless. And there is a pause here, another pause, but this is a more familiar pause. This is a pause for description for a landscape. We had one for Helm's Deep. We've had them for other important locations in the story. We'll get them for Minas Tirith. Great for anyone who's trying to make a film of this because it's all laid out for you, exactly what you need to know. And we get the description of what it had been, a place of gardens and trees, to what it is now, a place of pillars and chains. It's a great description, well worth going back to. And one phrase I've picked out that sort of sums up the ugliness of what they are looking at. It's like the graveyard of the unquiet dead. So a living place is now a place of death, denuded of anything of beauty. And there's a lot going on under the ground, of course, with the pits and caverns that have been excavated. And I suppose that stands for the undermining. So Saruman has undermined his own character. He's undermined what that place once stood for. So there is a sense of that connecting to his turn to evil. And then we get a little dip into Tolkien wordplay where Orthanc can mean in Elven languages Mount Fang, and in the language of the Mark, cunning mind. And I'm sure he absolutely loved that fortuitous, the way it broke down in the two languages. But Saruman shouldn't get too big for his boots because it is dismissed as being a little copy, a child's model of Barad-dûr. Thinking about this as a story. One of the intriguing things, of course, is that we never actually confront the bad guy, the big bad guy. We see his lesser versions, particularly Saruman, but also the Witch King. But the actual I himself is present in the ring and indirectly because he is disembodied. And so he is represented by things that are not him, the ring, the tower, Mordor itself. And you hold back. You don't give in book 2, or in fact, it's book 3 in Tolkien's scheme. But anyway, you don't give in the middle of this story the biggest, baddest tower. You hold back on that. And so the emphasis here is that this is just a shadow of the big shadow. As they ride past the once proud pillar with the white hand, we're again in the rider's point of view. We see that the hand is blood-stained and no longer white. This joint point of view is fascinating. I'm going to be looking out to see if he does it with other armies, but he does seem to often dip into seeing the Rohan as a group that have a single point of view that he enjoys being in. And Artie's Gandalf brings it all together by presenting us with the answer to the riddle with a kind of dramaturge skill. Because as they arrive at the gates, the mist clears, the sun shines, and they're at the doors of Isengard. Shall we continue with how Tolkien describes it? But the doors lay hurled and twisted on the ground, and all about stone cracked and splintered into countless jagged shards were scattered far and wide, or piled in ruinous heaps. So there's a couple of things going on here, well, more than a couple. We've got the surprise for the riders, who Gandalf didn't say. He said we're going for a parley, but they didn't know they were going to a ruin, to a battle that's already been lost by Saruman. He kept that back. But we also, as readers, have known that Merry and Pippin and the Ents were headed for Isengard. And the last we heard is that maybe they were going to their doom. So the nail-biting, what has happened to Merry and Pippin, still not completely answered yet, but we knew there was a possibility that Saruman may have been caught unawares by the arrival of the Ents, and the hints have been tending that way with the arrival of the Huorns and the other Ents. So we had slightly more knowledge than the riders. And we get another of Tolkien's sea imagery here. He says, if the great sea had risen in wrath and fallen on the hills with storm, it could have worked no greater ruin. So we get the sense of an elemental force that has undone Orthanc. It's a wonderful description. It's on page 161 in my version. It's well worth just looking at it. Full of lovely details that sum up this devastation, ending with, still dark and tall, unbroken by the storm, the tower of Orthanc stood. Pale waters lapped about its feet. Remember, Orthanc wasn't made by Saruman. It was made by the men of Numenor, so that's not been destroyed, whereas a lot of Saruman's lesser works have been. So we are in the point of view of the king and the company, who are marvelling. And then we get the answer that some of them had been waiting for. There they saw close beside them a great rubble heap, and suddenly they were aware of two small figures lying on it at their ease, grey-clad, hardly to be seen among the stones. There were bottles and bowls and platters laid beside them, as if they had just eaten well, and now rested from their labour. So we know our hobbits well enough now to know who they are. But we are also getting one of these rider point of view moments, because they are seeing the hobbits afresh for the first time. One seemed asleep. The other, with crossed legs and arms behind his head, leaned back against a broken rock and sent from his mouth long wisps and little rings of thin blue smoke. So Mary is the one who digs deep and finds the right words. One of the interesting things about this comedic passage, which is just lovely, is we've been waiting for this. The relief is huge when they are reunited with their friends. And we as the readers feel it, and it's expressed as well in some lovely exchange that follows. But just a little moment here. Merry is putting on his company manners. He calls himself Meriadoc, son of Saradoc, and Peregrine, son of Paladin, who is kicking awake. A bit of nice bathos there amongst the highfalutin language. Saradoc shows the Welsh, vaguely Celtic roots that Tolkien wanted for that nomenclature. And Paladin is purposely Gothic for the Tooks because he saw those as an older family, just so the language gives a hint of what he thought of the history of the various Hobbit families. Merry is wonderfully dry here. He explains gravely that, in answer to Gandalf's questions, that his orders come from Treebeard, who has taken over the management of Isengard. Great. I mean, he's matching Gandalf here for sort of wryness, isn't he? No wonder Gandalf loves the hobbits. They share his sense of humour. And so after this restraint, Gimli's outburst is just fabulous. What about your companions? A fine hunt you have led us, 200 leagues through fen and forest, battle and death to rescue you, and we find you feasting and idling and smoking, and so on. Wonderful stuff, including the insult, you woolly-footed and wool-pated truants. So he's letting loose here. And even Legolas gets a little sly moment here, because he says, oh yeah, you speak for me, Gimli, though I would sooner learn how they came by the wine. Their double act is just priceless. And in response to this banter, which of course Aragorn is not joining in, I bet he's laughing, Theoden says, it cannot be doubted that we witness the meeting of dear friends. And then he goes on to reveal that the hobbits are not unknown to him and his people, that his people call them the Hobbitlan, which obviously is quite close to Hobbit, and it means in their language, hole dweller. And then you get this exchange with Merry, where rather disappointingly, which always makes me laugh every time I read this, that Merry is astonished to find anyone's heard of them. And Theoden says, well, there are no legends of their deeds. And we get here Merry launching into the more important for the Hobbit's perspective, that their deeds are really of, eating and drinking and smoking. He starts to tell the history of pipeweed. Now, originally, apparently, Tolkien put a lot more here, but he then cut it out and moved it to the preface, which was a good decision, because we would, like Gandalf, want to interrupt and say, these hobbits will sit on the edge of ruin and discuss the pleasures of the table and so on, if you encourage them with undue patience. We don't want to get sidetracked to that extent. So Gandalf and Theoden and their people are sent off to meet Treebeard. And Gandalf here, interestingly, calls Treebeard, you will hear the speech of the oldest of all living things. Much scholarly ink has been spilt over who is the oldest thing in Middle-earth. Is it Tom Bombadil? What about the elves? I think the idea here is, in a way, Tom Bombadil is more like Gandalf, more like a spirit or a emanate, something almost demigodish about Tom, whereas Treebeard is a tree or an ent tree, so a living thing, creaturely thing of Middle-earth. So maybe that's how you can square that circle. And as they ride off, leaving the hobbits with Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn, the hobbits give Theoden a big thumbs up from them. He is their kind of king. The hobbits bowed low. So that is the King of Rohan, said Pippin in an undertone. A fine old fellow, very polite. So this connection between the youngest of the menfolk we meet in terms of culturally, the people of Rohan, they are very close or understand in some ways better than many the hobbits, who are also another sort of childlike young people in many ways. Their history is not very long or very venerable. Not much has happened, if the legends are to be believed. So there is a connection there between the two, which is cemented at this moment. And there we leave it before the meeting of the friends and a description of what has quite happened to Isengard. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.